This lecture covers the first part of Chapter 12, the cardiovascular system, and includes an overview of the system and the heart. So the first part of the cardiovascular system is the blood. Blood is a form of connective tissue with a liquid component called plasma and a variety of blood cells. So the tube on the right is what blood would look like immediately after you draw it out of a patient's vein. If you were to take that tube and place it in a centrifuge, which is a machine that spins it at a very high RPM, all of the solid components of the blood would settle at the bottom, and you'd be left with the plasma, which is like the yellow-colored fluid at the top. So let's look at a brief overview of the entire cardiovascular system. The heart is the organ that pumps blood through the system. Blood vessels are a network of passages to transport the blood to and from the body's cells. And there are a lot of different types of blood vessels. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So anytime you see the A in artery, think it's carrying blood away from the heart. Arterioles are smaller branches of arteries, which feed into the capillaries, which are tiny, tiny vessels where exchange of gas, nutrients, and waste products occur. The venules are small veins which drain the capillary beds, and those all feed into the veins, which are larger vessels which carry blood back to the heart. So let's look at the difference between veins and arteries. Veins move blood toward the heart, while arteries move blood away. Veins are very thin-walled, while arteries are thick-walled. Veins carry deoxygenated blood, while arteries carry oxygenated blood, and this is sort of a generality. There are cases in which the arteries have deoxygenated and veins have oxygenated, but we'll cover that later. Arteries have a higher pressure within their system because of the heart pumping into them, while veins have lower pressure. They also use valves in order to move the blood. The venous system actually holds way more blood than the arterial system does. It's a larger vessel. And remember that veins carry blood back to the heart from the tissues, and they contain valves, which are these like V-shaped flaps of tissue. As we move our body and move our muscles, the muscles sort of squeeze on the veins, which pushes blood towards the heart. Once the muscles relax, the blood would want to follow gravity and fall back down the venous system, but the valves will then snap closed and stop that from happening. So let's look at the structure of the heart. The pericardium is a serous membrane which covers the heart, and it has two layers, the parietal and the visceral. The visceral is the portion that adheres to the heart. So if you imagine blowing up a balloon and then pushing your fist into the balloon, there would be a layer of the balloon that would surround your fist, and that's kind of like the visceral layer. That's the one that adheres to your hand or adheres to the heart. And then the rest of the balloon that's not adhering to your hand would be more like the parietal layer. So between the visceral and the parietal layer is a potential space called the pericardial cavity. Usually those two layers are pretty much touching one another, but it is a space where fluid can collect or pus can collect. The visceral pericardium is also known as the epicardium, and that's the outer layer of the heart, so that's the portion of the balloon that's stuck to your hand. The myocardium is the middle layer of the heart, or the heart wall, and remember myo is the prefix that means muscle. The chambers of the heart are lined by epithelium called the endocardium. And the base of the heart is actually at the top of the heart, closer to your head, and it's where all of the great vessels enter and exit the heart. Whereas the apex is at the distal portion, it's more inferior. And that's kind of confusing because usually apex means the top of something or the crest of something, but in this case, it's actually opposite. So the right atrium receives blood from the body. The right ventricle receives blood from the right atria and delivers it to the pulmonary arteries. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary veins and delivers it to the left ventricle. The left ventricle then receives blood from the left atrium and it delivers it to the rest of the body. The wall between the two atria is called the interatrial septum, and the wall between the two ventricles is called the interventricular septum. So these are kind of two separate systems, if you think about it. The right side of the heart collects blood from the body and delivers it to the lungs, whereas the left side of the heart collects blood from the lungs and delivers it to the rest of the body. So now let's look at the great vessels. The superior vena cava drains blood from the head, neck, and upper extremities. And the inferior vena cava drains blood from the trunk and lower extremities. So these are very, very large vessels which drain either half of the body. The pulmonary arteries carry blood into the lungs, and this is the case when your artery is going to have deoxygenated blood, because blood is traveling away from the heart, so it's in an artery, but it's delivering the oxygen-poor blood from the body into the lungs. The pulmonary veins then drain the lungs back into the heart, and the aorta then delivers blood into the body. Okay, so let's take a look at the valves. So the atrioventricular valve, or the AV valve, separates the right atrium from the right ventricle, and it prevents backflow. So as the ventricle contracts, the back pressure will snap that AV valve closed, and then the blood won't be able to backflush into the atrium. The mitral valve separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. The aortic valve separates the left ventricle and the aorta. And the pulmonic valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary artery. Okay, let's look at a full cardiac cycle. So first, deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium by the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The right atrium then contracts. An increase in the pressure forces the AV valve to open, and blood enters the right ventricle. The right ventricle fills, and when it contracts, the AV valve closes and the pulmonic valve opens. And that is supposed to say AV valve, not AV node. So the right ventricle contracts, and blood is ejected through the pulmonary artery. So blood enters the lungs and becomes oxygenated. Then oxygenated blood enters the left atrium. Contraction of the left atrium increases the pressure, and then the pulmonic valve closes and the mitral valve opens. Blood is then ejected into the left ventricle, which then contracts. The mitral valve closes, the aortic valve opens, and then blood is pumped into the rest of the body through the aorta. Okay, let's take a look at the coronary arteries. So coronary arteries are blood that is diverted from the aorta to perfuse the myocardium, or the heart wall. So the right coronary artery supplies blood to the right ventricle, the posterior interventricular septum, and the inferior portion of the heart. And you can see that blood vessel, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery, come right off of the base of the aorta. The left coronary artery supplies the left lateral wall of the left ventricle, the anterior wall of the left ventricle, the right ventricle, and the interventricular septum. Okay, let's look at the electrical activity of the heart. Nodal cells are specialized cells which create electrical impulse at regular intervals. The sinoatrial node is a heart's pacemaker. So this is where most of the heart rate and the command of the electrical system of the heart comes from the SA node when the heart is healthy. The atrioventricular node collects impulses from the atria and propagates them to the ventricles. The bundle of His carries the impulse into the ventricular septum. So that's like this bundle of nervous tissue which can carry the impulse from the AV node down to the bundle branches. So the bundle of His divides into the right and left bundle branches, which then, as you can see, they go along each ventricle. And then the impulse will go into the Purkinje fibers, which are fibers that spread the impulse throughout the ventricular walls. The autonomic nervous system connects directly to the SA and AV nodes. So you remember this is your sympathetic or parasympathetic. The sympathetic tone of the heart increases the heart rate and increases the force of contraction, while the parasympathetic uses the vagus nerve or cranial nerve 10 to slow the heart rate back down. So an impulse will reach the SA node. It'll then propagate along both atria. The AV node will then pick up that electrical activity and it will propagate it along the bundle of His and then down to both bundle branches, which creates a contraction in the ventricles.